in our series of Conservationists in Action. And here we have a veteran participant in this program and in NCTC, Robert Michael Pyle. Bob has been out here 7 times. We were just counting recently. And this is a series, it's kind of interesting. The series we've always advertised as bringing writers, scientists, and conservationists to NCTC to inform the public. Well, you're all 3. So this should count as 3 of those. We've been doing this 15 years, and so Bob comes out here about every other year, and we're always thrilled to have you. And before we start talking about the monarch in the Americas, I've got to give you a little bit of Bob's voluminous biography, because it's quite an extraordinary background. To begin with, he has a BS in nature perception and protection, which is something I think more of us should study, and a master's in nature interpretation from the University of Washington. He has a Ph.D. from Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He's basically done butterfly studies around the world. He's been integral in the formation of the Xerces Society, in the protection of butterflies long before it popped up on our radar in the Fish and Wildlife Service. And in between, he's written a tremendous number of articles, essays, and books. Just a few of my favorites are Wintergreen, which won the John Burroughs Medal, if I recall correctly, Chasing Monarchs, which we're going to address today, Migrating with the Butterflies of Passage. He's written the Audubon Society Field Guide to North American Butterflies, a handbook for butterfly watchers, The Butterflies of Cascadia, Walking the High Ridge, Life is a Field Trip. Actually, you came out and talked to us about that book.
That's true.
Mariposa Road, and his most recent book is a book of poetry, if I'm not mistaken, called Evolution of the Genus Iris. So, Bob, welcome back. It's a pleasure to have you. And today, we're probably going to focus on monarchs, something that is close to your heart. You've been working on for a long time, so we really appreciate you coming out here.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks so much for having me. It's a treat to be here. Yeah, I forgot about coming here for the one book. It might be my 8th visit, perhaps.
We got to keep better track of these
But
things.
I love it. It's one of the most beautiful campuses anywhere in the world. And some of the nicest and kindest people here, and some of the greatest professionals. Very much enjoyed coming here every time. And this time it's very special to talk about monarchs. It's such an exciting time for monarchs.
Yeah, we've gotten very interested in it in the last year or so.
Fish and Wildlife Service really seems to be taking the lead here in a big way.
And I think probably the question that's on a lot of our minds, because it wasn't necessarily at the top of our radar until recent years, is if you could tell us a little about the monarch's life cycle and how some of that might be affecting its survival.
Sure. Well, the most salient thing to recall about monarchs right up front is its extraordinary coevolution with milkweeds. I think we have a graphic for that there. You're going to have to edit this. Monarchs and milkweeds have co-evolved for a very long time. No one knows how long. I suppose the geology people could give a reckoning as to how many millions of years the 2 groups of organisms might have occurred together. But it goes way, way back that the entire subfamily of brush-footed butterflies called the Danaini, or the milkweed butterflies, have been co-linked with this plant. And so I say this plant, but there are a number of species, of course, around the world, and most of them in the New World, but not all. And every species of butterfly in the Danaini subfamily feeds on some member of the milkweed family, Asclepiadaceae, and that's to the exclusion of other foods. They really must have milkweeds. They've thrown their lot in evolutionary with milkweeds, and vice versa. So the milkweeds have developed some particular protective strategies that the monarchs have turned to their own advantage as well. So you find a monarch caterpillar feeding on a leaf of common milkweed, that could be right here at NCTC. And you know that when milkweed leaves or stems are cut, a white latex comes out.
Yes.
And that latex is full of complicated chemicals, in particular a group known as cardinalides. And these include some powerful heart poisons and some powerful emetics, and they're very, very distasteful. Well, the caterpillar, as you saw in the picture, was able to consume them, and then it sequesters those chemicals into its own tissues, which are then passed on through the beautiful green jade box of the chrysalis and on through the remarkable process of metamorphosis to the adult butterfly, which emerges all bright and pretty and shiny with its white spots and its brilliant orange coloration with the black lines across it and all the white spots on the body, all of which are dramatic advertisements to predators that I don't taste good, and you're not going to be happy if you taste it. So this was perceived by scientists for a very long time as a likely relationship that led to the education of birds. Darwin, Wallace, Bates, Beebe, all of them prognosticated that. But it was finally up to a scientist who lives not far from here on the Blue Ridge Parkway, Lincoln Pearson Brower, and Jane Van Zandt Brower at Amherst College in the 1950s and 60s performed a series of experiments that they then took on to Oxford as well on a Guggenheim Fellowship, and then came back and published the lead article in Scientific American in February of 1969, I believe it is, showing that what all these old naturalists and scientists thought took place really does take place. So if you look at the panel of photographs on the right, there's a naive blue jay, that is one that has not been exposed to monarchs before, and it's hungry, not starving, but hungry, and it's given a monarch. In the second picture, it's chomping up the monarch. In the third picture, it's spitting out the wings, which is common. Lots of birds eat butterflies and then spit the wings out. In the third picture on the left, it's kind of thinking about the whole thing. The middle picture, it's not looking entirely convinced that this was a good idea. And now we can go completely anthropomorphic in the sixth picture, and it's looking back and saying, hey, Doc, can we start this experiment over again? But it's too late, because here comes one of the most famous pictures in American biology down in the lower left, the picture of the barfing blue jay. And it's funny in a way. It wasn't very funny for the jay. But the point is, it wasn't mortal to the jay. It didn't kill the jay. It taught the jay that this is an extremely unpleasant experience. Next to the last picture, the equally piquant but not quite so well-remembered photograph of the retching jay. And this may be more important because here's where the serious learning is going on. And finally, the last picture, you've got your educated blue jay complete with its cap and gown. And that's a jay that's never going to take a monarch again, or a butterfly that has evolved to look like the monarch, as have viceroys and some other butterflies. So this is a very important thing to remember about monarchs. Their coevolution with milkweeds and how that works to the advantage of both the monarchs, obviously, but also to the milkweeds, because they know what their own predators are, exclude most of the others, and they can deal with a degree of predation by monarchs.
So far, so good. All right, they're
So far,
not
so
being
good.
eaten by jays, at least after they're educated. They
Well protected in
coexist
various
with
ways.
milkweed. This was a very common plant when I was a child in Wisconsin. We'd see acre after acre of milkweed. What's the problem now?
The problem now is it has many, many prongs. One of them has been the diminution of the forests in which they overwinter, but we'll talk about that when we come to the migration. But the problem as regards milkweeds has been a dramatic decrease in the acreage of milkweeds in North America. The monarchs, as you know, migrate back into North America in the summertime for their breeding generations. The monarch subfamily, Danaani, are all tropical, and none of them can overwinter in the freezing northern climes. And so in order to utilize and exploit this vast milkweed resource in the north, they have actually evolved a bird-like migration back and forth. We'll come to that, but the point is that when they get here, they have to find a lot of milkweed. And that milkweed has persisted, possibly even expanded, during the era of human European post-contact colonization and agriculture, because the milkweed is a weed in the sense that it is adaptable. And so it's been able to grow on the edges of fields, along roadsides, in so-called waste ground. There is no waste ground, but what's commonly called that. And even in the extensive agricultural fields of the Midwest, the milkweed doesn't really hurt the crops, doesn't really hurt anything, but it, in an opportunistic way, persists throughout the breadbasket. And the breadbasket the middle America is where most of the monarchs breed and originate from to fill in the migration. There are monarchs on the East Coast, on parts of the West Coast. There are several flyways, but the vast preponderance of them originate in the summertime in the Midwest. That milkweed resource has been dramatically reduced in recent years, primarily because of the introduction of genetically modified organisms, crops known as Roundup Ready, both soybeans and corn, and now some others as well, that permit and virtually require farmers, whose fault this is not, by the way, to use a great many more pesticides, a great many more herbicides in order to take advantage of the new seeds. And in doing so, they create what a chemical manager calls a clean field. In other words, a field that's absolutely devoid of life other than the crop. It may bring some economic advantage, I don't think very much, but it brings dramatic decrease in the overall functioning of the ecosystem and the loss of probably somewhere between 60 and 90% of the Midwestern milkweed in the past couple of decades.
So we're cutting off their food source.
Cutting off their food source.
At least two ways. This is fascinating. I want to ask, because before I switch to history, my background is evolutionary biology, and you've already answered some interesting questions, why they migrate, why they overwinter, when so many butterflies don't. Is there a chance, you just mentioned the milkweed became more common after Europeans contact here. Is there a chance their numbers were artificially high because of human effects?
That's a very good question. In fact, there has been a hypothesis put forth by some monarch butterfly scientists at the British Museum of Natural History, Dick Wainwright and Phil Ackery, who dubbed this the Columbus hypothesis. And they suggested that the bulk of the North American migratory phenomenon might be quite recent, that it, in fact, has evolved or developed to the extent that we know it in post-contact times. This is not demonstrable. It's hypothetical. And what I said about possibly being more milkweed in post-contact times, that's hypothetical also. Sure. Because when the prairies were vast and untilled, before the cow and the plow, certainly there was a lot of milkweed. And we don't know. It may be that the monarch migration was even bigger, that it's a post-Pleistocene phenomenon of really quite some age, maybe a million years or more. But it's also entirely possible that that was a modest phenomenon that a portion of the population engaged in that was then underwent ecological release with agriculture and the milkweed expanding to where it might have reached its peak in the 19th and early 20th centuries. That's possible too, which puts kind of a kink in the statement one sees a lot that this migration goes back to time immemorial. We don't know that at all.
Right.
It can't have been like it as it is now at the peak of the ice advances, for example. It's got to be relatively recent, this extent. But one thing to remember is the rapidity with which this group of butterflies, which are inclined toward seasonal emigratory and immigratory movements. The monarch's not the only species in the group that does this. And the monarch, having been introduced to Australia, has developed migration within about 75 years. So the group's inclined there. It is entirely likely that it can kick it off pretty quickly under the right conditions. On the other hand, the actual nature of migration, the ability to have that capacity to shuck and jive with the shifting climate and the shifting plants, that's got to be quite ancient.
Yeah. You've already talked about one fascinating thing, and that's the coevolution of monarchs and their primary food source, milkweed. The other thing we've been alluding to, and I think we ought to jump into it now, is their extraordinary migration. So
Good.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, just a little bit about that. In the autumn, one notices monarchs in the sky. Now, it's not commonly like this anymore north of the border. However, people have seen a scene like this in New England, in Manitoba, in Minnesota, in the Dakotas, and down toward the Gulf in the past, certainly in the 19th century and some earlier in the 20th. And I don't think anyone's seen a sky like this in the 21st century north of the border, but you can still see it in Mexico when you're nearing the places where the monarchs gather. But the point is that in the fall, the monarchs go to the skies. And this was noticed for a very long time. A government biologist, sort of a predecessor of the Fish and Wildlife Service biologists, known as C.V. Riley, noticed in the 1860s that this was occurring. And he was probably the first to posit that a migration actually was occurring. But it wasn't until 1975, astonishingly, one of the most recent dramatic natural history discoveries of all, that colleagues of Professor Fred Urquhart of Ontario, having been tagging monarchs with thousands of volunteers for decades, finally, with the help of some local Indians and Ajita Terras and others, tracked the monarchs to their major overwintering grounds in Mexico. 1975. And then it was finally known that the bulk of the monarchs that breed in north of the Mexican and U.S. border actually do migrate to Mexico for the winter. It had been known for over 100 years that the westernmost monarchs migrated to the California coast for the winter. And I believe we're going to see some footage of that shortly. But as the knowledge of the migration began to grow with more and more people doing tagging, this is the model that grew up. And it was based on very few data, actually, but it became an extremely widely repeated theory. One sees in a million magazine articles, books, and film strips. I call it the bicameral model, or the Berlin Wall model of monarchs, that all the monarchs east of the Rocky Mountains who breed in the north migrate to the mountains of Mexico. And that statement, so far as it goes, is true, or almost true. But it also posited that all the monarchs born west of the Rockies migrated to the California coast. This struck me as improbable because I lived in Colorado growing up and saw monarchs crossing the Rockies. And I wondered about the monarchs in western Colorado and the Great Basin. Are they really going to cross all the basins and ranges to get to the California coast, or are they going to follow the rivers south? And in fact, in 1996, I followed the monarch migration for one entire season, and I found that, in fact, there were monarchs west of the Rocky Mountains also going to Mexico. And so in one afternoon at the Mexican border, I was able to observe a phenomenon which caused one of the oldest, strongest cannons in American natural history to just go out the door.
But exploded a scientific paradigm.
I did, but not by doing any great science. I did it by being out of doors with my eyes open, which was what we should all be doing all the time. Just asking the question, could it really work this way? It didn't seem completely parsimonious to me, and then found that, in fact, it didn't work that way. Now we know a lot more about that. The people in Arizona have been very active lately, and we're finding that there's more movement between Arizona and Mexico than anyone ever knew. There's even little movement between California and Arizona, which shows that a new model that Lincoln Brower and I published just a few years ago is in fact correct, suggesting that the eastern and western migratory phenomena are linked. Consequently, our approach to their conservation has to be linked. And this is why I've been so thrilled by the initiatives of the Fish and Wildlife Service and Director Ash's encouragement for everyone to take part in monarch conservation east and west of the Rockies as if they're one big system, because they are one big system. So that's been quite thrilling to realize. There was, by the way, another model put forth that there might be entirely new overwintering grounds in the Sierra Madre Occidental, but that seems not to have been proven out. In fact, with climate change, even the existing wintering grounds in the mountains west of Mexico City are becoming hotter and drier all the time, and the Sierra Madre is too hot and dry to support the winter population.
As you alluded to, we do have some B-roll footage of overwintering grounds on the coast of California, Monterey, Pismo Beach, and so on. Why don't we look at a little bit of that so we can actually see the monarchs in motion?
That's a good idea, and we can talk about tagging. And,
I'd be very interested in your observations. This was shot very recently, last December, by our videographer, Ryan Haggerty, in preparation for doing more outreach on monarchs.
Very good.
Which you're a critical part to, Bob.
Thank you. In this initial picture, we see the monarchs on eucalyptus. And this is one of the most interesting parts of the story. Well, there's a pupa that's actually on milkweed out in California. And there's the adult nectaring on, I can't tell quite what that nectar flower is. And here's a female that's come out of her chrysalis, getting ready to probably take her initial flight. Now, here we see a number of monarchs that are grasping a pine. And this is nice to see because Pinus radiata, the Monterey pine, is one of their native wintering trees in California. Notice that one of the monarchs in this picture, you can barely see it, has a blue tag in the hind wing. Mm-hmm. There we go. You can see it now. So the tagging studies have been going on since the 1930s, much more aggressively in the past, in the past 50 years a lot, but now we have tags that adhere to the wings better with smaller messages, and of course we have websites and so on, and easier to convey the information. So we're learning a lot about where the monarchs are going, still through tagging. We do not yet have microelectronics sufficient to track monarchs from a satellite. We do have transmitters that can be used to track a butterfly flying across a meadow from a person with a nearby receiver, but not yet anything small and precise enough to track them by satellite. When that happens, then of course we'll know very much more very quickly. In the meantime, we're still back in the medieval technique of putting a sticky tag on their wings. But because we have a lot of citizen scientists out there doing that and watching for them, we've learned a lot that way. But where they're in the eucalyptus, this brings about a very interesting point. We're all devotees of native plants, of course, and protecting the native plant communities. But it's also becoming more and more talked about that we need to recognize that in some cases, the exotic plants, the introduced plants that are commonly called alien or invasive plants, sometimes have come to represent valuable resources to native animals. And that's a hard thing to admit when you're trying to get rid of those plants. But it's important to recognize it because sometimes we get rid of those plants in our aggressive efforts to control alien plants and take away a resource that the native animals have adapted to. And unless we recognize that and replace it with a native plant that provides the same resources, then those animals can be in trouble because of weed control efforts. And that's counterintuitive, but it happens, I'm afraid, a lot more than we want to recognize. So here now, the monarchs on the eucalyptus, you see how their tarsal distance is just right for the width of a eucalyptus leaf. And the thermal qualities of the eucalyptus turn out to be just as good as Monterey pines or cypresses at maintaining their very delicate thermal balance in the winter. Because remember, they migrate to California or to Mexico not to be warm. They're not going to Cancun to bask on the beach. They're going to the high mountains of Mexico or the cold, foggy coast of California in order to be cool, to preserve the fat through the winter that they have laid down during their migration and their nectaring. And so because the California coastal forests have been so fragmented, it happens to be a matter of grace and the grace of happenstance that the introduced eucalyptus have come in and provided an alternative winter refuge for the monarchs. And if that were not the case, and the California native plants people hate to hear this, but if that were not the case, the westernmost migratory monarchs that have been celebrated by everyone from John Steinbeck in Sweet Thursday to the Beach Boys in their Monterey cycle might well be extinct. We might not have the West Coast migratory monarchs now if it were not for the eucalyptus. So now while we try to rebuild the native forests of pines, cypresses, live oaks, and redwoods to provide the structure, we need to use the introduced eucalyptus in the meantime.
It's fascinating how they're all gathered in clumps here. What virtues does that provide?
It provides thermal regulation. By the way, on this eucalyptus shot, look at the notches out of the leaf. Yeah. There's a species of bug called the lerp psyllid that cuts out those little notches on the edge of the leaf and can be a real danger to the eucalyptus. But you see here where they're gathered that it's probably a cool, foggy day or the morning. Temperatures are cold, and they need to keep their collective body temperature, if you will, if you think of the monarch cluster as an organism, kind of the Gaia hypothesis, or like a jelly or another coelenterate where you have lots of little animals making a big one. So if you think of the cluster as an animal, it has to have its core temperature to a certain level so that they well, they don't freeze. Now, they're not going to freeze in California probably, but they could get too wet, too cold, end up on the ground and still die. Now we're seeing a lot more movement, and that's because the sun is striking them. They're reaching the core temperature. They're exceeding the core temperature, which often puts them to flight. And that can be a danger for the monarchs in Mexico in particular, because as the logging thins the forest can no longer hold the core temperature. They get too cold by night and freeze, too hot by day, fly too much and burn up their fat.
Oh my God.
So it's as Lincoln Brower, who is really the key figure in monarch biology and conservation of the second half of the 20th and all of the 21st century so far, the intellectual and conservation legatee, if you will, of Fred Urquhart, Lincoln is responsible for these things still even existing to this day by obtaining the Mexican presidential decrees to protect the forest in Mexico, by devoting his life to understanding their biology and prosecuting the necessary conservation measures. But as Lincoln put it way back when he and I started working on monarch conservation together in 1980, he said, these animals live on an ecological knife edge. And unless that knife edge is maintained, they're going to fall to one side or the other. And that is largely based on thermodynamics. It's the plants that provide the thermodynamics, plus the clustering bodies of the monarchs.
You mentioned Lincoln Brower a couple times. We should let people know he is coming out here in April. So
Good.
We've got a tag team of lepidopterists.
Link and I have often tag teamed. Link and I had the same major professor at Yale University, Charles Remington, who founded the Lepidopterist Society and was really the fundamental Lepidoptera science fixture in most of the past 75 years. Lincoln taught a lot of the people who are today's working lepidopterists and scientists. Well, Lincoln preceded me by a while at Yale, but he was Charles Remington's first graduate student, and I was one of his mid-career ones. And so we've known each other forever, but it was in 1972, months after I had founded the Xerces Society, when I came to a Lepidopterist Society meeting to present the Xerces Society, kind of his coming out party. Xerces Society, named for the extinct Xerces blue butterfly, is the primary body for international body for invertebrate conservation, based in Portland. 44 years out now. But that first year it was founded, I came to that meeting, met Lincoln, and we talked about monarch conservation in 1972, before the clusters were even known in Mexico. And then when they were found in 1975, we got together again in 1976 with a group of international lepidopterists. I was chairing the Lepidoptera Specialist Group for IUCN, and at our first meeting in Washington, D.C., 1976, we declared the monarchs and their migratory North American phenomenon the #1 priority in butterfly conservation. So that goes way back. And then in 83, they were listed in the Invertebrate Rate Data Book, which I had the honor and the onus of editing, as an endangered phenomenon. I believe we said threatened phenomenon. And Lincoln was coming up with the same idea at the same time. And then later, we became the co-chairs of the Monarch Project of Xerces. So we've been doing this tag team for a long time. In Mexico, we've lobbied the governor of Michoacan together. We have been into the colonies together a lot, and we've shared many a podium. Lincoln and I can do a fairly effective 1-2 punch sometimes. So
great.
I hope that you'll have a wonderful time with him.
And I'm sure he'll reference you. Let me backtrack to an interesting thing you said. In the early 70s already, the monarch was perceived as a priority. And then you used a term that probably is new to a lot of conservation biologists, endangered phenomenon.
That's right.
What's going on here? Why was it made a priority, and what is this endangered phenomenon?
In 1975, if you look back at that old National Geographic that first announces it to the world, although it prevaricated and said they were in the Sierra Madre because it was thought at the time that they would be protected if they were a secret, which of course was naive in the extreme. They weren't in the Sierra Madre, they were in the Transvolcanic ranges. But it was clear to everyone, I think, then that that this was going to be a challenge, because there's no other single organism that I'm aware of, even eels, that are so dispersed at one time of their life and so collected at another time. So they're, an ecologist would say, an R organism, very generalist in the summertime, widespread, abundant, and then in the wintertime they're gathered together in, as we know, just a few hectares of the Mexican mountains, and a little more area, but far fewer monarchs on the California coast. So imagine, talk about putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
They're extraordinarily vulnerable down there to logging, to fire. Think about fire.
Yeah.
You know, a moth to a flame doesn't go, it burns for about a half an hour. Annie Dillard wrote a piece about that once. A moth at a candle becomes a candle.
Yeah.
So think about all that fat that they stored up coming south. What fire in those forests would do. It's extraordinarily vulnerable. And that's why we said, just a year after they were found, this has to be the number one priority. It's the grandest spectacle in butterflies. It is, it's the grandest case of insect migration ever evolved, to our knowledge, and various other things. It's got to be a high priority. Well, but it wasn't an endangered species. Obviously, it was introduced to lots of other countries. It's common in Hawaii. It's common in Australia, or was becoming that way then. And so what do you call it? I was editing the Invertebrate Red Data book at the time with Sue Wells and Mark Collins, and we said, well, we need a new category for the IUCN World Wildlife Fund Red Data books. We need a category of the threatened phenomenon. Not spectacle, we thought about that, but that sounds a little too shallow, like you're just protecting the show of it all. It's much more than that, it's a phenomenon. And so we designated, I think, about 10 of them in the Invertebrate Red Data book, including the giant colonies of thatch ants in Japan, certain reef effulgences and others, but the monarch was the most dramatic one. And Lincoln and I like to joke about, forgive the pretension, of being like Darwin and Wallace coming up with natural selection at the same time. You know, well, this happens in intellectual history, that when an idea is right, it does arise in more than one mind, more than one milieu, more than one culture. And so Link and I virtually simultaneously came up with the idea of threatened or endangered phenomenon. He published it in a paper, I published it in the Red Data book, and we both realized we'd both come up with this and have been talking about it ever since. And this provides a basis for conserving a feature which is doesn't strictly qualify as being endangered at this specific level. We'll see if that applies with the Endangered Species Act. A lot of us are hoping that it has the amplitude to accommodate that idea, and particularly it ought to through the feature of the act that deals with endangered or likely to become endangered over a significant portion of its range. That's certainly true of the monarch.
Before we leave migration, because I know you've written about this, it seems like the monarch migration is extreme in the butterfly world. And tell us a little about how it does this amazing migration, because it seems like its wings and body and everything about it is too small to make this migration that is at the longish end of even bird migrations.
I'm so glad you asked that question, Mark, because I did leave it a bit as if everyone knows these things. Well, it would be extremely hubristic of me to suggest I really understand it. But I understand parts of it, and I'm the only person to my knowledge who spent an entire season physically trying to follow the migration. Obviously, I don't fly. So how did I do that? Well, I followed them on the ground as far as I could, and then when they took off, I got there with the compass. I got their, what's known as their vanishing bearing, not their heading. You watch an airplane, and it might be heading that way but flying that way. Same with monarchs. Get their actual vanishing bearing, and by following those vanishing bearings, I was able to stay with the trend of the migration right the way to the giant surprise of the Mexican border. Well, the way it works is this, in essence. Let's start with the monarch coming out of its pupa in Maine or Manitoba or Montana in September.
Okay.
The final generation of summer is different from the earlier generations. It's, on average, wings are larger, muscles are bigger, and its gonads are atrophied, or at least they have not developed. It's in what's called reproductive diapause. And this is a condition brought about through its hormonal climate, which in turn has been dictated or keyed by the actual, not the climate, but the day length. The day length is absolutely key. As the length of day diminishes, these hormonal changes take place that alter the physiological nature of the animal. So when it comes out of the chrysalis, instead of being hot to trot for mating, it's hot to trot to migrate. And they move out. Now, statistically, you're going to have some individuals that mate at any given time because it's a gradient, but the majority of the population is migratory. So how do they do it? Well, they can fly fast and strong because they're big, strong butterflies. Nonetheless, you can't maintain 30 or 40 knots for long without a whole lot of calories. So what they'll do is they'll drink the nectar of flowers. Milkweed is a great one, goldenrod, rabbit brush in the Great Basin, asters, the whole panoply of autumn flowers. And as they do, they get both the calories needed for their daily sugar high to fly with, but they also are building up fat that they'll need for the winter. Then what they do, and this is absolutely key, and I've watched this a number of times, is they'll glide around and elegantly sense air movements and temperatures, gradients, find a thermal. There's a beautiful picture in my dormitory, the Rachel Carson dormitory, of Rachel Carson sitting at Hawk Mountain watching the hawks fly. Yeah. They do the same thing. They find a thermal and they go up in the air. I've seen them go hundreds of feet in the air in a thermal. And David Gibault has flown with them at thousands of feet in a fixed-wing glider. Crazy. So they go way up, and then, and here's a key word in their migration, they glide. They stop, and I watched it with binoculars. They start gliding, and they have a really superb glide ratio, about 1 in 4, so that they'll cover about 4 feet forward for every foot they go down. And so they cover a lot of ground that way. Then they'll come down, they'll get more nectar, they'll go up again. Yeah. They might have to fly up. They flap until they get some lift. Yeah. And sometimes the air temperature, pressure is such they're not going to get a thermal, and they just have to fly. They won't get as far that day. But on the whole, they seem to be average. They seem to be able to average anywhere from 40 to 100 miles in a day. We're guessing something like that. And sometimes probably even more. And then if they actually get on a fairly strong wind, but you got to be careful what actual strong winds, because they can tear wings if you're not careful, especially if you get blown into a bush or something. So David Gibault again has found that they're able to actually adjust their glide ratio by taking on more or less water in their crop. Butterflies, like birds, have a crop, and they store nectar there and they store water there. But you can imagine that as they put more fat on their abdomen, it changes their center of gravity, and they get butt heavy. Yeah. And so naturally that would shift your glide ratio and you would stall too soon. Yeah. And so they take on more water up front in the crop. It's like moving the little piece of lead on a balsa wood glider forward. So you drop the center of gravity and you're not going to stall. And they do this in order to maintain the optimal glide ratio for their weight. It's extraordinarily sophisticated. And this is all happening with a little poppy seed of a brain. Now, then you ask, how do they know where they're going?
Yeah, that was my next question. Well,
it's been demonstrated that they do have a sun compass. Sonia Altizer and Chip Taylor have shown they have a sun compass, which means that they don't have to just follow the sun and go like that and start out flying east and end up flying west at the end of the day. With the sun compass, they can adjust themselves to the perihelion and the shifting sun, what appears to be the shifting sun, and keep a standard course. It's also thought that they may well use magnetism. They have magnetite in their heads, but the one study that's been done seemed to have been flawed and it was withdrawn. Even so, a lot of us suspect that they are using magnetism in the same way that pigeons do. Pigeons have several backup systems. What they're not using, as many birds use in migration, is the moon, because we don't believe they migrate at night. This hasn't been observed anyway. It's probably not warm enough, usually, though they can fly in much colder temperatures than most butterflies. Monarchs, painted ladies, red admirables, and several other butterflies, most of which are migratory, in one way or another, not the same kind of migration, are able to shiver, as bumblebees and moths do too, and raise their body temperature that way. And therefore, they're not strictly poikilothermic. They actually are warm-blooded to a tiny little extent that they can raise their temperature enough to fly when it's colder. So they fly colder than others. Well, so with a sun compass, possibly with magnetism, and remember that all of the monarch wintering grounds in Mexico are oriented basically in a circle around one of the oldest crystallized plutons in the New World, a highly magnetized area. They might actually be honing in on that area magnetically. This isn't demonstrated, but it's not far-fetched. And then also one of the few things that I've actually brought to this discussion that's semi-original, I think, is that I've emphasized over and over and over that I think they're using features of the landscape visually. I'm not the first person to ever think this, but it was basically blown off for a long time by a lot of the monarch people as not plausible. But we know that their vision's much better than we used to think it was. Certainly very strong for color, and certainly from a height they can detect green. They can detect brown. Green means roost trees and nectar. Brown means aridity, probably. And they do follow rivers. I have demonstrated this personally by doing it with them. And now recently some studies have been done that corroborate that, which of course always makes you feel good. But they follow rivers, they follow roads, they follow power lines, they follow all kinds of corridors that accumulate vegetation. But here's something I think is very cool. They'll follow the river just as far as the river suits their purposes. Then if the river, which means it's going roughly in the direction they want to go, then if the river shifts and goes somewhere else, they shift. So I followed monarchs out of the northwest in the autumn of '96 down the Snake River, which was going southeast, not south as everybody said the northwestern monarchs did, southeast all the way to Burley, Montana. I'm not saying every monarch in that area was following the snake, but a lot of them were. Then when they got to Burley, Idaho, the river turns back northeast toward its source in the Tetons. Well, no monarch in October is going to turn toward the Tetons. Right. That would be maladaptive. And so right there at Burley, Idaho, it's so cool to see, they leave the snake, head straight out across the undifferentiated terrain up over Adobe Pass and down into, of all things, the Great Basin. And what do you get to down there? You get to the Bonneville Salt Flats. Monarchs migrating the Bonneville Salt Flats? Well, it turns out that Edwin Way Teal, the great naturalist, in his American Season series, in Autumn Across America, which I was reading during that trip, I found that he saw monarchs at the Bonneville Salt Flats in the autumn of '52. So I went and I camped out in the freeway rest area, which had 18 Russian olives planted in planters for shade. And in the morning I got up and watched, and the monarchs started coming out of those. They had found the only trees for who knows how many miles to cross the Bonneville Salt Flats. Then when they get down, they'll start picking up the Green River, the Colorado River, and on down.
Fascinating.
They are. Oh, but one last, I'm sorry I'm going on about this so much, but that's the...
It's clear you delight in it.
Well, I do delight in it. That's the southerly migration, all one generation. Same monarch that starts out is the one that ends up in Mexico or in California. Yes, tissue paper, but strong. Remember, World War I fighters were made out of tissue paper and balsa wood. So they're made out of chitin, which is really pretty strong, and their tissue paper is just more chitin, double membrane. It's actually pretty strong things if they don't get smashed against a bush. Well, then they overwinter in the pictures such as we've seen, trying to remain as torpid as possible to maintain their fat. That's all they got to do. They go down to the ground and take water, sometimes too much, and become saturated and die in the water. That can happen also. But they, most of them, the majority of them remain surviving in the trees. And then come the spring equinox, the longer days, their hormones go crazy again. They become not asexual, but hypersexual. It's a virtual orgy on the wintering grounds. And then they start north again. They've got enough fat left to begin the migration. But now they're not gliding. They're flying close to the ground. They're flapping. They're mating. And naturally they die. But along the way, if things go right, the females will have laid enough eggs on the early spring milkweed to start the next generation, which, if it's warm, will produce new monarchs within a month, and then another month. And so it's 3 or 4 generations refilling the north for the single generation that goes south.
What a fascinating lifestyle.
Utterly.
One threat we haven't talked about, but I know people would be thinking about, is global warming.
Yes.
Does that have an impact on monarchs?
I believe that global warming is both a threat and an opportunity for monarchs.
Provocative statement.
It's not a denier statement, I'll tell you that. It's just that any time a major environmental change occurs, some organisms take advantage of it and some of them don't. That'll be true with global warming.
Right.
Obviously, there will be species that take advantage. Many of them are going to be common adaptable species. We're going to lose a lot of rare species and mountaintop species and things like that. But monarchs, since they are generalists at part of their life cycle and specialists at another, is going to depend on which one of those is more affected by global warming. So in Mexico, we're very concerned that the mountains where they are able to overwinter in the Oyamel fir trees, ABEs religiosa, only occur between about 9,500 feet and 11,000 feet. Below that, there's plenty of trees, but they're pines, and they're too hot. They don't work. And above that is the mountaintop, and it's just bare. So they've got to have that narrow band, that knife edge. Well, that's becoming narrower, both because of agriculture and logging below, but also because it's getting hotter. So the monarchs are being pushed up the mountain, and when you go to see them now, you usually have to hike a little farther than you did 15 years ago when the monarchs were overwintering farther down the mountain. Now, that's something that varies with the weather,
Right.
and that can be very different from the climate. The weather goes up to make the climate. But you could go next year, it could be a cold winter, and they could be way down the mountain. So it's not necessarily a every year advanced thing. But there is a real concern, and I've heard Mexican scientists at a recent colloquium suggest that in 50 years, their model suggested that there would be no place in Mexico capable of supporting a cool, moist Oyamel fir forest except for can you say it?
No.
Popocatépetl, I think that's it. Popocatépetl. The volcano is near Mexico City.
Okay.
And the monarchs don't occur there now. So could they find their way there? Who knows?
Yeah.
So that's a real threat. On the other hand, if you read Barbara Kingsolver's magnificent novel, Flight Behavior, her storyline posits monarchs shifting their overwintering northward into the southern Appalachia, which may seem outrageous, but she came and talked to Lincoln Brower at length to get her biology right, and did so. Yeah, sure, it's conjectural, hypothetical, but it could happen, and then it would put them in danger of a very strong freeze, which is, in the book, that's the tension going on there. But Barbara's trained, as a biologist, and she's absolutely keen and prescient in suggesting that their overwintering ranges probably will change. And I have suggested that on the West Coast, I wouldn't be surprised to see monarchs reclaiming old wintering grounds they once had in Mendocino and haven't had since the droughts have been bad, and possibly even extending up into the redwoods, which could be superb monarch overwintering forests if the temperature regime were right, possibly even into Oregon. Now, monarchs in California have been terribly affected not only by high property prices and development of the coast. That's obviously a threat to their groves. But another one has been inadvertent eucalyptus removal. It's not inadvertent, but not knowing it's going to hurt the monarchs. But another one is the droughts. The droughts in California are, even though they had some rain earlier this spring and late winter, not much lately, and the reservoirs are way down, and the water wars in California are, I'm afraid, only just beginning, and they've been bad for 100 years. So how the monarchs will adapt to the drought there, I don't know. But if that means they move more toward the cooler, moister maritime Northwest, maybe we'll have them a shorter migration, but still working. That could work. And the other way that global warming in some areas at least, might advantage monarchs is by creating a larger area conducive to milkweeds. So milkweeds, for example, do not grow in southwest Washington, where I live, or northwest Oregon, but they seem to be possibly advancing in that direction. And so as we warm and dry a little bit, we might have more milkweed territory. On the other hand, the old milkweed territory may get too dry and too hot for them. So it's going to be an extremely complex mix. And that's going to be interesting to see.
I'll have to bring you back and
yeah,
evaluate what's going on.
Right. I'm still here. So monarchs certainly will be affected by global warming. And there's some real danger from it and some possible opportunities as well.
Well, Bob, you very effectively laid out why this is a fascinating butterfly and also some of the challenges it faces. As we come to the last few minutes of the broadcast, could you tell us some things we could do to protect the monarch, or help at least?
Certainly. Let's look at a picture here. The logo of the Monarch Conservation Group in Mexico uses the same graphic. It shows a monarch in a pair of hands. And I feel that it's very, very apropos. The future of monarchs is in our hands. And this is not too pretentious of a thing to say because of the power that those hands wield, both for good and for ill when it comes to our wildlife. The future of all our butterflies is in our hands. I mean, it's not everything about them. Obviously, they're elegant, adapted, evolutionarily versatile creatures. And Darwin and Wallace and Bates also said that butterflies are so useful for evolutionary studies because their wings are canvases of evolution. So we would be way too presumptuous of us to say that everything about their future is in our hands. But their survival certainly may be in many cases. And when it comes to monarchs, I think that applies to a very high degree because this iconic butterfly carries within it the capacity for extraordinary biological success or extraordinary biological fragility. This one is a female, you see, with the broad, dark veins, a little bit deeper cinnamon color, and no black spots on the hind wings, whereas this one is a male, a brighter tangerine color, thinner black veins, and the black spots in the hind wings, which are the sex scales or sex brands, also known as stigmata. And those are deep pockets of velvety scales bearing glands at their base that produce the male pheromones. They are extraordinarily versatile, and one could say well adapted for all the reasons we've discussed here today. Roger Tory Peterson, the great naturalist, used to tell me, Bob, monarchs will take care of themselves. They'll be okay. And I used to think that was true, and he really believed that, because when you go out and you see them, it'd be the monarch of the Americas. It'd be the monarch of America. It's the icon. Do you know it was once introduced in Congress as our national butterfly? Leon Panetta was the sponsor for that. Yeah. But then he got bigger fish to fry. Everybody got bigger fish to fry, I guess, and it never was passed. But it is our de facto monarch of the Americas, our de facto bonding organism between all three countries of the North Americas, and it's also our icon. Well, fine. Does that make it invulnerable? Sadly not, because of what I and many others have called the passenger pigeon syndrome. There are people now with the petition for the listing of the monarch who say, including lepidopterists, including conservationists, who say, how could that possibly be? This is the icon of America. This could never become extinct. But you know that was said about the passenger pigeon too. And when an extremely well-adapted organism that's very, very abundant gets to a certain point where its conditions are no longer met, there is such a thing that we know as the tipping point. Tipping point's a key phrase these days, a catchphrase, but it's a very real thing biologically and with extinction. And that's what happened with Melanoplis, the plague grasshopper that was the plague locust of this country, most abundant animal in North America probably, and then it became extinct as an animal. Same thing with the passenger pigeon. So monarch, I fear, people say, oh, there's 65 million. How could it be endangered? Well, 65 million may be approaching the tipping point. And so what can people do? That's the key thing. People can support every possible effort for all kinds of wildlife conservation all the time. But in particular, what they can do is to support milkweed and other nectaring resources and larval resources. Now, let me say clearly that this should be, boy, that sounds like a statement out of Washington, D.C., doesn't it? Let me state this very clearly. But it's an important one.
You need a caveat.
Yeah, that it's got to be the right milkweeds in the right places. So that photograph showed common milkweed, or it could be showy milkweed of the West as well. They look a lot alike. That has a certain range, and there are lots of other species of milkweed. And everyone working to conserve monarchs should find out whether they live in an area where swamp milkweed does well, whether the orange butterfly weed does well, whether common milkweed, narrow-leaved milkweed, green milkweed, the ram's horn milkweed, there are lots of others, and not plant something they get from a seed company far away, because there's a lot of local adaptation of the locally breeding monarchs to those milkweeds. And Lincoln Brower showed with his co-workers that there's such a thing as a spectrum of palatability. Not all the milkweeds are equally toxic, and there's some plants that are easier to grow, but they have fewer toxins, and you can end up breeding monarchs that aren't as well protected against their predators. And now there's a brand new danger in that regard. There's a very common milkweed in the South called tropical milkweed, Asclepias curasavica. And it's very pretty. It's orange. The flowers are yellow and orange, or yellow and red, and very pretty. And it's easier to grow than many species. And you can grow it with facility in a lot of warm areas, not just tropical. And it's very readily available, too, as a seed or a start. And so it's been popular, and a lot of people are growing them in Florida and around the Gulf in California. It turns out that it's a monarch bubble gum, that the monarchs flying south in their migration will find succulent tropical milkweed in October in Texas or in Florida and stay, abort the migration, because the stimulus of fresh food plants can counteract the day length enough to make them say, oh, well, maybe I'll mate and lay eggs after all. And so what we're getting is non-migratory resident populations around the Gulf as the Gulf warms up. And that's not a bad thing in and of itself, but it is depriving the Mexican overwintering population of a lot of its immigrants, and that means the numbers won't be sufficient to refill the North next year. So people who are trying to help monarchs with tropical milkweed may in fact be doing more harm than good. So get the right kind of milkweed, and I would suggest to anyone to go online to Xerces.org, Xerces.org, who have an absolutely stunningly good milkweed replacement program going on right now. Monarch Watch is another good source. And then, of course, Fish and Wildlife Service now is working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the National Wildlife Federation to put a lot of resources into milkweed replenishment. There's going to be a great big milkweed corridor along the north-south freeways. Lots of good things are in play. And maybe, it won't be easy to counteract the millions of acres of milkweed habitat lost to GMO crops. It won't be easy, but perhaps we can work on stemming that tide and changing agricultural practices, giving farmers sufficient incentives to have more natural fields and to invite the milkweed back. And at the same time, we can maximize milkweed everywhere else, and that will help the monarchs.
Well, I think on that potentially hopeful note, we should go out and hope the next generation does a good job with milkweed. Bob, I can't thank you enough for what was an eloquent and even profound description of monarchs and why we should care about them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Let's look at this last picture, because that's what I hope we'll be able to maintain into the future, is the opportunity for every child to encounter the great monarch of the Americas and to find them in their backyard and to rear their caterpillars. Let's hope that stays with us. Thanks for having me back to NCTC, Mark.
Thank you, Bob.